you can find in a lot of, religious texts going back thousands of years, stories of, sort of encounters with sort of supernatural entities, that kind of thing. And, I think one of the, not so much the problems, but one of the issues, of course, is when we're dealing with accounts that were written thousands of years ago, the problem is, we don't have anybody to do interviews with, on a first-hand basis who was there at the time. So, we're sort of having to just rely solely on how different people interpret different things. Now, of course, somebody who, as you say, like a Christian may interpret, one particular event from a religious perspective, and somebody else may say, well, that was a UFO event. So I think it's important to sort of get across both sides of the the scenario, of the argument, to demonstrate that clearly something strange happened, and then try and figure out exactly what it was, or this issue with immortality that I talk about in the book, and people having thousands of years ago extensive lifespans. Was that was that due to sort of the hand of God, so to speak, or was it due to some sort of scientific sort of genetic engineering? So I think the important thing is that we can kind of sort of look at this and debate it and try and figure out what the actual answer is. So, there are rumors, for example, I talk in the book, there's some sort of conspiracy angles in the book that talk about how a lot of research, secret research, has been done by government agencies into this issue of immortality to try and see if they can figure out to slow the aging process down and to fully understand why and how we do age. We know the process of why we age. It's because the cells in our body only divide so many times, and when the division stops happening, that's when our bodies start to age. And so we know why that process happens, but what we don't really understand fully is why it sort of kicks in at a certain point, which allows, today most of us to sort of live into our 80s. For example, it's the same lifespan coming from sort of ancient documents and understanding the secrets of alchemy and things like this. So, it's a controversial story, but it's one that sort of very much kind of mirrors a lot of the other accounts as well. You can find, some of the major figures within the Bible, who had these extensive lifespans, like Adam, like Methuselah, who was, reportedly the oldest man, period, lived to 969. But then you had other ones like Seth and Enosh and Canaan and Jared and many, within the Bible, even Noah himself as well, had extensive lifespans that came close to roughly 1,000 years. And again, the big question is, how was that achieved? Was it just something that was, something that, it was given to a certain elite? Because we don't sort of see, in these biblical tales or other religious accounts where it was everybody who was living to that age. It was like a specific lineage, as if perhaps they'd been, altered or genetically manipulated so that they would have this sort of immortality or near immortality gene running through them. And that's something we find in, cultures all around the world where the average person doesn't have immortality, but the gods, whether it's from the Christian Bible or the Greek legend, the Greek legends or the Egyptian tales and the stories from ancient India, they all talk about the gods having the extensive lifespans or at full-blown immortality, and very often it came from ingesting certain substances, and occasionally they would share this sort of elixir, if you like, with the human population, or at least elements of them, and then they would find that they would then become immortal or have at least extensive lifespans. And of course, again, the big question that sort of provokes is this the work, of a god, or is it down to some sort of, science which has created a cocktail that essentially prevents us from aging. So, but I find it interesting, that you have stories like this all around the planet thousands of years ago from cultures that had no contact with each other, and yet the accounts are almost identical, really. Is the calendar and things like this. So, I mean, some people who are skeptical of this issue have kind of made that point, have said, well, do we know for sure that back then, that in every culture around the world, that a year was perceived as being, 365 days. If you said, for example, that in one particular culture a year was perceived as being 36 days, then that would, sort of put you sort of 900 years or whatever. But, the only reason we count a year as 365 days is because that's how long it takes the Earth to go around the sun. And so for that reason, we have that calendar in mind. That's how we, define our ages. It's just purely down to, the orbit of the Earth around the sun, as I said. But if you had earlier cultures who weren't actually driven by, that particular situation, then they might well have, a year to them may have been sort of 45 days, 60 days, in which case, looking back at it from our perspective today, it would seem they were much older. But the interesting thing is that in some of these accounts, they do make sort of differentiation between the people who have the extensive lifespans and those who don't. So, in other words, they're not saying that everybody lived, to 900 or whatever. So that's an important thing where it does kind of suggest that it was more sort of a specific body of people rather than everybody. One of the interesting things that a lot of people don't know is that, the book of Enoch, which actually isn't in the Bible, but the book of Enoch talks about how when Noah was born, he looked very different to the average baby. His skin was said to be like extremely white, like almost like a sheet of paper white. And his hair was white and his eyes shone like a pinkish color. Now, this kind of sounds a little bit as if he might have been an albino. And if you actually sort of Google Noah plus albino, you can find a number of interesting stories online that have sort of theorized that. But on the other hand, we have this man who supposedly lived for hundreds and hundreds of years and looked very different to the average person. Now, what's intriguing is that if you go back to the old sort of Mesopotamian legends of the Anunnaki, a lot of the research that's been done into the nature of the Anunnaki have suggested that they, from interpreting the old stories and the legends, that they may have had extremely pale skin, to the point where the closest thing we could imagine to them would be an albino. So, you have that kind of tie in there, which suggests that maybe Noah was something more than just, a regular person, so to speak. When it comes to the Anunnaki, I mean, a lot of stuff's been written about it, which a lot of it is theoretical, and I point this out in the book that, for example, most of the material that we have in hand today on the Anunnaki, in terms of them being extraterrestrials, largely comes from the interpretations of Zecharia Sitchin. He was somebody who really sort of opened the door to the Anunnaki/ET angle, and other people have followed on since. What I've always tried to do when I mention Sitchin in my books is to point out that these were Sitchin's theories and concepts and ideas, rather than sort of hard evidence. And I think, providing you tell your readers that this is what this person has concluded based on their assessment of the data, I think that's, the important way to go, rather than have them assume that it's 100% provable that the Anunnaki did come from some faraway planet or star system. So that's one important thing. But in terms of, I think, it's difficult to know for sure if the Anunnaki, if they did exist, if they did leave behind, evidence of their existence. Now, there are rumors, for example. I mean, for example, Zecharia Sitchin, he felt that the massive stones in Baalbek in the Lebanon, they're literally gigantic stones. He felt that they were something that the Anunnaki constructed as part of some sort of spaceport almost, and he felt that what we're seeing is the sort of remnants of this spaceport. But of course, then you could, on the other side of the coin, so to speak, somebody of a more down-to-earth approach would just say, well, that was just made by people who, were skilled in masonry, and stones and that kind of thing. So it really depends on how, each individual perceives these ancient artifacts, sort of out of place, massive stones, blocks of stone, it's the same with the pyramids, you can find any number of people who believe that extraterrestrials built the pyramids. I'm sure the people who believe that would say that, that could be evidence of something that the Anunnaki left behind, even though we have no evidence for that. So in other words, the fact that in 21st century civilization, we are still surrounded by sort of enigmatic, massive objects and stones that we don't really fully understand the nature of them and why they were constructed even. It's inevitable, I think, that people are going to say, or some people are going to say, yeah, this is the evidence that's left behind, even if the Anunnaki aren't here anymore. Yeah, I mean, a lot of people don't realize the sort of sheer power of the atomic weapons that we have today. The dangerous thing is that there are people today who think you can win a nuclear war. You cannot. It's impossible. Every side would lose. It's impossible to fight a nuclear war and win. And one of the reasons is because the weapons, the atomic weapons today are so powerful and massive, when they say, well, one side's got 4,000, we've got 3,000, Chinese have got however many thousand, it doesn't matter, like just a couple of hundred can obliterate, entire countries. I mean, massive countries like Russia, China, the US. You don't need the thousands that we've got. Unfortunately for us, if it ever happened, just hundreds, the low hundreds would do it. The ones that could be used today, they're many times more powerful than the ones that were dropped on Japan, and they were powerful enough alone. But it is interesting that we do actually find sort of residuals of what may be ancient atomic war. I mean, I'll give you an example of that. When the first atomic bomb was tested out in the New Mexico desert in 1945, before the two were dropped on Japan, one of the things the scientists didn't realize was going to happen was that the sheer temperature actually sort of fused the desert sand into like a glassy substance, which became known as trinitite. And what happens is that temperature raises to such a point and so quickly that it literally sort of turns the sand into this sort of greenish liquid, which very quickly solidifies. And as I said, it's known as trinitite. Now, what's interesting, and it looks like a green glass, like little specks of green glass. Now, what's interesting is that in numerous places across the Middle East, you can find very similar phenomena to trinitite that has been dated back thousands of years. And so that's kind of intriguing in itself, that, you know, the very substances that we find, you know, when an atomic bomb explodes today, we have an almost identical phenomena to trinitite that's been found in Israel, been found in Egypt, and all across the Middle East, as if there could have been sort of cataclysmic atomic exchanges in the Middle East thousands of years ago. And I'll give you another good example. The famous Egyptian pharaoh Tutankhamun, he actually wore a piece of this sort of green stone around his neck in a necklace, and you can actually see that if you go online. And for him, it was just, you know, it was sort of like a cool piece of, like an ornament to wear around his neck, so to speak. And but when you sort of compare it to trinitite, there really isn't that much difference. You know, for example, if a meteorite comes through the Earth's atmosphere, you know, it heats up so quickly to incredible temperatures. And if it slams into the ground, then, you know, you would have kind of a similar situation because of the incredible heat. But one of the things I point out in the book is that if, for example, we have a situation where, you know, meteorites are coming through the Earth's atmosphere even thousands of years ago, arguably they should crash down at just random places. You know, one could have been in what is today North America, one could come down in South America, one in the North Pole, another one on what is France today. But the big mystery is why so many of them, over extensive periods of time, came down in the Middle East. You know, it's almost impossible to believe that they would randomly all come down in that area across, you know, numerous years. Arguably, they should come down, you know, randomly around the planet. So that's one of the reasons why I don't think we can rule out the meteorite or comet or anything like that, but I do find it intriguing that, you know, why should it be that the Middle East was so targeted by meteorites, you know, that come into the atmosphere at random, when the rest of the planet isn't showing evidence of massive amounts of this sort of strange trinitite type material. And people, again, like Zecharia Sitchin, he believed that, you know, the Annunaki sort of genetically manipulated sort of early proto-humans, so to speak, and upgraded them. And he believed that sort of the story of the story of the Garden of Eden was essentially almost like a distorted tale of how the human race was sort of, you know, DNA was used or altered to upgrade us to something more than just like a semi-ape-like animal. Now, of course, you know, that provokes a great deal of argument between people who support the ancient astronaut angle and those of more of a religious persuasion. And but again, I think, you know, the fact that we can sit down and discuss it, I think, is the most important thing of all. You know, rather than just sort of butting heads, so to speak, and ignoring the situation completely. You know, I think it's important that we do sort of address all this. But you're right. Yeah, I mean, sort of the area that's known today as the Middle East, it dominates numerous early religions. Like, for example, my book, Immortality of the Gods, people have said to me, how can you say this when the Bible says this or that? And I said, well, if you read the book carefully, I'm not saying this. What I've said is that researchers of the phenomenon believe this. Zecharia Sitchin interpreted things in this format and came to believe this, which is very different from saying we know for sure that ancient astronauts came to the Earth, which we don't know for sure. A lot of it is down to interpretation. And that's why I'm always sort of careful to write things in that style, to point out to people what we know for sure versus what is a belief system versus what is an interpretation of an ancient text. And I think if you do that, then you're on safe ground. I think when you have, even I have problems when just, somebody will matter-of-factly say in a book, the Annunaki, fought ancient nuclear wars in the Middle East. I don't go that far and say that kind of such an explicit thing. What I do is sort of point out the parallels, as we just mentioned, with things like Trinitite, which are suggestive that there might have been ancient nuclear wars in the past involving extraterrestrials. But being suggestive isn't proof. But for some people, it is proof. And that's where I think we need to sort of change our approach a little bit when it comes to things that occurred thousands of years ago, to where we understand the difference between belief, evidence, and interpretation. And for some people, the lines do get blurry. So the prime theories within the whole ancient astronaut community, when it comes to the story of Jonah, that maybe, he was abducted on board a UFO. Now, people think of UFOs, they think of things in the sky, but there are actually a lot of reports of UFOs coming out of the water in oceans and, rivers and lakes, that kind of thing. And so, again, you can interpret it from the perspective of that this large whale was actually some sort of submersible submarine type UFO that had the ability to sort of take to the skies as well. And perhaps Jonah was taken on board some sort of craft which then went underneath the water. And for the people of that era, interpreting it as a whale would probably make a great deal of sense, because they really wouldn't have a concept of what a UFO actually was. So to see possibly sort of like a grey-silver UFO or something like that briefly surface, they might well think, it's a huge whale. And then this man gets taken on board and then brought back later. The issue of, being taken on board a craft and, taken into sort of the belly of a whale, you're right when you bring up the issue of, the stomach and the acids to digest food. And when Jonah was reportedly in the body of the whale, for several days, which, if that was the case, then really, he should have been a dead man. It's like, God forbid it happens, but if you swallowed a fly, and it went into your stomach, it wouldn't last long. It would be a nice thing to think about, but your body would digest it extremely quickly. One of the interesting things about today's ufology is that, a lot of it is dominated by alien abduction stories. Now, within the abduction law, so to speak, there are a lot of accounts of people being taken on board craft where, they have DNA removed, skin cells, eggs, sperm, that kind of thing. And there's very often, sort of a genetic component and also a reproductive component to a lot of these abduction stories. Now, you can actually draw parallels with the ancient accounts of, when you hear about, the gods coming down and taking human wives, and then you have these sort of half-human, half-godlike entities that sometimes were known as demigods and things like this. And when you look at the ancient stories, of sort of the gods taking human wives, and then, there are these sort of semi-human or more than human people, which are the offspring of the gods and human women. And you kind of do find parallels with today's abduction stories. It may have changed in terms of certain aspects of it, but there is still that genetic reproductive component. And one of the theories for the black-eyed children is that they are some sort of half human, half alien entity. That they're sort of like a hybrid. And admittedly, when you hear the reports and speak to the witnesses, which I've done quite extensively, as has David Weatherly, who wrote the definitive book on the black-eyed children. There are certain characteristics that are similar between the black-eyed children and the so-called grey aliens of ufology. The first point, obviously, being the black eyes. The solid black eyes that both of them have. Also the very pale skin, and they're sort of, they're skinny and small. And they try and, camouflage themselves with these hoodies that they pull down, and they look at the ground. They don't want you to see the face properly. You could make a case for the idea that, they are extraterrestrial hybrids. But, from the religious perspective, there are actually a lot of people who also believe that the black-eyed children could be sort of literally demonic as well, and then they always have the theory that maybe there's a connection between the two, from the perspective that, could demonic activity sort of actually be reliant upon science? Is it possible that, sort of demonic entities can be sort of created, out of genes and the manipulation of the body and so forth. And you have a lot of theories that sort of at one end for the black-eyed children you have the alien angle, then you have the demonic theory at the other end, and then various other theories somewhere in between as well. Sort of the more popular theories for the Greys, that they aren't sort of aliens that are themselves coming here, to do the things they perform, but they're actually just sort of almost sort of like biological robots, and maybe that's what they are. We think of robots, you think of sort of 1950s sort of clunky, clanking robots on sci-fi movies, that kind of thing. But today, the robots that we're building now, they're sort of highly sophisticated and extremely human-looking. If you see some of the human-looking robots that are now being built, they look almost, human. I mean, kind of creepy a little bit, but that's how they look. So, in other words, it's not at all out of the question that within perhaps not too long a time away, we could be building biological robots to perform specific tasks around the home and things like that, in the workplace. And so if somebody else has had a leap on us of thousands of years, their technology might be highly advanced. So, and there is a good body of evidence to suggest that the Greys are sort of like worker-type drones, because they never really do anything other than just perform the same activities over and over again. People talk about being abducted by them. There's this sort of very cold and clinical and matter-of-fact genetic experiments and so forth on board a craft, and then the person is taken back again. There's never really much in the way of, would you like a tour around the craft, or that other things happen. It's just the same thing, as if they're repeating, almost as if they've got like an inbuilt program, sort of like a computer program that just performs the same tasks over and over again. So, I wouldn't be at all surprised that if if it was proved the Greys were sort of biological robots just performing tasks, that wouldn't surprise me at all, really. What I do think is that there is some sort of infiltration going on. I don't think there's any doubt about that. And the black-eyed children seem to be a part of that. When I say infiltration, I do mean that from like a sinister perspective. Whether you view these entities as paranormal or aliens, I don't think it's like a positive thing from our perspective, even though we might be told it is. It's almost, they tell us and it's all okay, it's been done for your own good, but I'm not sure it actually is at all. So, but in terms of, sort of trying to sort of provoke immortality in our world today, I'm not sure, I haven't seen evidence that the black-eyed children might be involved in doing that. But there are a lot of rumors and stories about sort of military agencies and scientific bodies that are under sort of secret contract to the government to research all this on behalf of what we might call sort of like a global elite, to see if they can achieve immortality while the rest of us still have our sort of measly 85 years or whatever. There are a number of accounts, for example, concerning the war in Iraq, when the invasion occurred in 2003, and that there were certain people in Iraq looking for ancient artifacts, a number of them surrounding the story of the ancient king Gilgamesh, who was supposedly the offspring of a human and a god, and he was known as a demigod, and he supposedly ruled in part of what is today Iraq for 130 years. And we don't know how old he was when he supposedly came to power, but if he was 25 or 30 when he came to power, and he ruled for 130 years, that would mean he lived to 160. So if that is the case, then he clearly wasn't a normal human. And there are a lot of rumors coming out of Iraq that somebody was on the search for the secrets of Gilgamesh when, you had all the carnage of the war going on, and that under the radar and behind the scenes, when, the war was taking place, there was all this chaos, that somebody was looking in specific areas for information on Gilgamesh and to try and figure out if there might be any evidence left that would sort of open the doors to immortality. Zecharia Sitchin actually pointed this out as well, and he suggested that, for example, that there were a lot of similarities between the ancient Indian gods and the stories of the ancient Indian gods and some of those coming from the Middle East and elsewhere. And, if you are talking about sort of spacefaring aliens that could zip around the planet, then, a sort of body of gods seen in ancient Greece or ancient Rome or India or the Middle East, they could actually all be part and parcel of one particular, originating point. If you use the Annunaki as an example, if the stories of the Annunaki are true, literal, and they did visit the Earth, thousands of years ago, well, they would clearly have the technology to sort of zip around the planet in no time at all. So, in other words, they may well have established colonies in different parts of the world, and the people of those eras, gave them their own titles and names. And so, in India you have one particular god, in, say, ancient Greece you have another, and they were distinctly different for as far as the cultures of those areas were concerned, but they may actually have had exactly the same origins. And you could also make an argument that perhaps if the Anunnaki really did visit and did everything that's attributed to them, they may actually have felt it was worth their while to actually convince people they were gods, that they were sort of, all-powerful gods and you better listen to us. That would be an ideal way to sort of control people. And back then, when times were more simple, that would probably have a deep bearing on their, their approach to life. That you have all these all-powerful, ruthless gods looking over them 24/7. You can understand how they would sort of be in awe of them, and so they could well have been the same ones all around the planet, just sort of, as I said, incorporated into the cultures of different countries, would change the stories a little bit country by country, but the basic themes would be the same. Yeah, there's actually a few legends like that where to retain your youth, so to speak, you either had to sort of be in the company of the gods, or have the access to the secrets of immortality. Like, for example, in ancient India, there was this substance called amrita. And, in ancient Greece, you had the ambrosia of the gods. And then, in the Bible, when you had the Exodus from Egypt, there was this mysterious food called manna that came down from heaven. And throughout all cultures, you can find that where, the gods are able to sort of provide immortality in various different ways by these mysterious substances and drinks and cocktails and things like this. But also, there are accounts, for example, of just being with the gods, so to speak, had an ability to sort of slow the aging process. I mean, a classic example, England, where I'm originally from, there's a long tradition of stories of fairies. Now, today, people think of fairies, they think of like Tinkerbell, like a little figure with wings flitted around the Christmas tree or whatever. But if you go back and read the old legends, they're actually nothing like that. The fairies were sort of 3 foot tall. They would live in underground, and they would come out at night and steal babies. And if you read the stories, they actually sound very similar to today's abduction stories. But one of the interesting things is that when people would visit the so-called fairy kingdom, and they would find that they wouldn't age, or that when they went back to the real world, so to speak, they would say still be 30, but all their friends and family were long gone. They were sort of a century had passed, as if their aging process had slowed down or had been slowed down. So again, even with the old sort of folkloric tales of like goblins and fairies, you also find this angle that when you mingle with them, your lifespan extends and your aging process slows down. I gave a lecture at the Dallas-Fort Worth MUFON group, and David came along, and as I mentioned earlier, David's written the definitive book on the black-eyed children. And both me and David have uncovered stories where people have been dabbling with Ouija boards and had sort of opened the door, so to speak, to encounters with everything from sort of like black-eyed children and also particularly the Men in Black. People think of the Men in Black, they think the movie versions like Tommy Lee Jones and Will Smith, But the reality is a lot of the Men in Black are described as very weird. They're not unlike the black-eyed children. They don't actually have the solid black eyes, but they're very often described as skinny and pale and gaunt, and they look really sort of menacing and strange. And I've got actually close to 24 reports now altogether of people who've been dabbling with Ouija boards, and then sort of within 24 hours of the event, they've been visited by Men in Black type characters, as if the process of using the Ouija board has sort of opened a doorway or a portal to something that has allowed these things to come through. And of course, when people dabble with things like Ouija boards, it's okay, it's easy, I should say, in many respects, to open a door. Sometimes it's not that easy to close the door after you've opened it, and unfortunately people realize that when it's too late. But yeah, there's definitely a pattern, though, of people using Ouija boards and then things like the black-eyed children and the Men in Black turning up. It's, these events occur so often, and in terms of the time frame as well, that it's clearly beyond coincidence. The Greys supposedly have the ability to remove the human soul during abductions, and some people have talked about how they were physically abducted, but then when they were on board the craft, they saw themselves above their body, as if their soul had been temporarily removed from their physical body. And Whitley Strieber talked a bit about that as well, about how supposedly, the Greys were able to sort of manipulate the human soul for various reasons. Yeah, it's just sort of lesser known aspect of it, but there are actually a lot of reports where in UFO cases people have been visited by women in black, and they're like the Men in Black. They look very pale, emotionless, and just strange looking, but it's just sort of a lesser known aspect. It kind of also ties in with the black-eyed children as well. The sort of the world kind of calms down a bit, and we try and get on an even keel because, as I said before, it's easy to sort of suddenly go down the path of war, when And today, a world war, we can't win it. And, we're hearing a lot lately about a third world war and things like that. And, I think if we can all find a way to sort of step back, take a breath, and just realize that going down that path is just insanity, it's just guaranteed destruction. As I said, people think, oh, well, if we don't like the Russians, we'll just bomb them. But, you can't do that because, a lot of people don't realize that every major power has satellites orbiting the Earth. And, like, for example, the Russians have got satellites that monitor every single U.S. missile silo in the United States. And, when a missile is launched, it has what they call a heat signature. And they can see every time, if those missiles are launched from the US or from Russia or from China, all three countries can see if, anybody else is launching the missiles. So, in other words, if you were to launch your missiles, within seconds they would be launching theirs back because they can see you've already launched. Nobody can make a sneak attack anymore because technology is so in advance in terms of, watching every missile silo all around the world. And so, I said the sheer scale of the missiles today, we can't shoot them out the sky. That's ridiculous. So anybody who starts a nuclear war is guaranteeing their own destruction anyway. That's for everybody. Now, we've come close to nuclear war a couple of times, like the Cuban Missile Crisis. And admittedly, there were some weird events that occurred in the northern part of the US in 1975, where UFOs were seen around a lot of nuclear bases in the northern part of the country. And there are a lot of stories about the missile silos actually being briefly sort of shut down by the UFO entities, and then the silos would start working again. And obviously we didn't use the missiles, but it was almost like it was a show of force by somebody to say, hey, we're just showing you that we can shut down your entire missile fleet, so to speak. So in that sense, maybe somebody would intervene. We just don't really know, but let's hope it doesn't come to the point where they have to, let's just hope we can, get across to people. That is one of the major things today, is that people just don't understand what a third world war would be. It would go from tanks and aircraft for probably the first week or so, and then when one side starts to lose, they'll use like a small tactical nuclear weapon, and then the other side will use one, and then it'll grow and grow. And then if they all press the button, within 40 minutes, it'll all be over. And, you just couldn't imagine, what the landscape would look like afterwards. It would just be pulverized everywhere.